Hello everyone, my name is Alda. Very nice to meet you. I have helped YLI a lot actually in my experiences, whether it comes to YLI overall program design, but also including YLI application and registration process when it comes to the participants. And with this opportunity, I would just like to share with you some tips in CV writings, just because in case you didn't know, there are a lot of applicants every year. We receive maybe hundreds, even sometimes more than 1,000 of applicants. So you can imagine the many CVs that we have to screen. I have fortunately been part of that process as well. So I have seen many CVs from past participants before. I've seen the good, I've seen the great, and I've also seen the bad and the worst. So hopefully what you will see next can be helpful for you if you are indeed interested in applying for YLI. So first thing that you have to know, right, is why is it that you have to submit a CV, right? The answer might be very obvious to you, but just as a refresher, right, there are about 3 things that I want you to know, right? So what should a CV do, right? The first must-have is that the CV needs to tell us exactly who you are, right? A CV, what it is that it should be an accurate representation of your professional story, right? Even though you've not worked before, what we're interested in knowing is who you are, even if you are still a student in a university, right? So how do you do that? In short, what you want to do is that you want to accurately represent yourself, not only in terms of your identity, right? So your name has to be accurate, that's an obvious one, but it should really reflect and capture who you are at that moment in time when you do submit that CV, right? Now, the second one is that the CV must create a positive impression of you somehow. Now, this is the trickiest thing that I think people struggle a lot with. But just to share with you, right, when I do read CVs, when I do read many CVs at once, the CVs that does stand out and the CVs that does create a positive impression does so within probably 3 to 5 seconds even, right? So I'm going to share a little bit about that later, but that's basically the second thing, quite important thing that you need to know, right, about what a CV should do. Now, the third and last thing is that the CV should really describe your accomplishments, right? Now, even though this may sound a little bit obvious, let me tell you the exact difference, right, between stating what you have done or stating what activities that you've been part of, right? Versus also describing the impact that you created, right? Now, I cannot stress enough how important the last one is, right? Usually a lot of people get it wrong, but we will get to it later. So those are basically the top 3 things that you need to know about what a CV should do. Now, a lot of past participants or future participants have also come to us and asked us many questions around CVs, right? And what we've been able to do is gather the most common questions, and we would like to just go through these with you, right? In case you're also wondering all these things in your head, let's get them out of the way, right? So number 1, how many pages do I need for my CV? Basically, the answer is the shorter the better, but you also want to have enough details to express yourself and describe your achievements, but it should not be longer than 2 pages, right? So if you're writing your CV and then you find yourself on the 3rd, 4th, or even 5th page, that's when you know you're doing something wrong and that you're probably writing an essay instead of a CV, right? So really good to just challenge yourself and be concise, be to the point, and stick with 2 pages at most. And this is already including your personal identification at the beginning of the CV and your aspiration statement, right? So 2 is the answer. The next one would be, how many CVs do I need, right? For us, for me personally, right, it's not necessarily a question on how many CVs do you need, but it's on the content itself, right? So it's more around adjusting what key messages you have in your CVs. It's more about adjusting what you want to show in your CV, right? Because a CV can serve you many purposes, right? Again, it should capture a representation of your professional story, right? But which one? And this can be very different for when you apply for YLI, right? Which in this case is usually most interested in knowing about your leadership skills, right? Or it could be for a very specific line of work, right? A very specific function or industry that you're interested in, right? And so with that, every time you apply for something, you might want to adjust. Not might. You need to adjust the content of your CV, right? Next question would be, do I need to attach my photo in it? In what pose, size, and where should I put it? Now again, if you're applying for YLI, because it is an electronic submission, fortunately you don't have to worry about all these things, right? Because we do not ask for your photo. But if you are applying for a particular job or a program elsewhere, unless specifically asked, I personally do not recommend you to voluntarily attach a photo, right? So it's good, I guess, that you are confident that it might add value in your submission. But unfortunately, what happens in reality is that unconscious bias is always around, right? And we do not want to give an opportunity for people to apply that unconscious bias just by looking what your gender is, looking how you look like, basically, right? So wherever not asked for, I suggest that you do not put it. But in the event where they do ask for it, right? Because there are some there are some professions that require for you to put your photo, then put one in a most professional manner, right? So be sure that you are very representable when you look, very professional looking. Make sure your face can be clearly seen, right? So don't have, for the ladies or fellas with long hair, don't have bangs covering your face and everything. And then pose straight, right? I think you should know what I mean. Now, the next question is to put reference name important? Who should I put? Do I need to put their contact details as well? Now, this really depends, right? Now, what this depends on is whether or not you already do have past connections that would really speak well for you, right? When they do get contacted from the employer, right? The reason you want to do this is because you want them to come across as genuine as possible when they talk about you, right? So if you feel like you've had a strong bond with maybe your past peers or your past bosses, for example, your past managers, then do put them, right? Contact number, unless you know for sure that the people, your references are comfortable with you putting their contact number, then feel free to do so. But otherwise, you can put a little note saying available by request, right? And usually the employer is much more than happy to, will likely accept that, right? But what happens if you don't have anyone necessarily, right? That, I mean, yes, you know, you've had past managers and everything, but your exposure is quite limited, right? You've never gone really one-to-one, heart-to-heart chats with them. They don't really know much about your development. They don't really know how you grew professionally in the moment in time when you were working with them or his or her team. Then I suggest that you do not put that, right? And then focus on expressing more of what your achievements were, right? So that's that. Next question is around who should I ask to review my CV, right? Now, for this one, basically the answer is anyone who have undergone a similar situation with you, right? And this is most likely when someone has applied to the same company or program that you are currently applying to as well, right? So for example, if you are interested in applying for YLI, then I'm pretty sure you might know one or two seniors who have done this in the past and have succeeded as well in getting into the program, right? So one of the reason why you should be comfortable with that is because there is a reason why we picked them to begin with, right? And that's because their CV caught our attention. Because really, the CV was our first contact, right, in knowing who this person is. So you can rely on your seniors who have succeeded and completed the YLI program. If this is in the workplace in general, then what you can do is find out anyone that you know who are currently working there, same logic, right? Or someone who has worked in a similar company before, so similar in industry nature or in function nature, right? So you can do that. Last but not least, the last FAQ is, should I put my junior high or high school experience? Because I was a ketua OSIS back then. So although some experiences might be relevant, and I'm talking in case of YLI, right? Some cases might be relevant to leadership. It's always good to keep a time frame of not more than 5 years, right? The reason is because we do not want information that is outdated, right? You do not want to word up and cloud out your CVs with experiences that are no longer relevant, right? But going back to, let's say, high school is still okay, right? But focus, we really encourage you to express more on your experiences as recent as possible, basically, right? So in your university life, right? Or if you're watching this video and then you've already graduated and you're currently looking for a job, anything most recent is always better. Now, moving on to the next topic is one of my favorite ones. Basically, what are the general mistakes in CV writing? Now, the reason why this excites me a lot is because, as I mentioned earlier in the beginning of the video, I have had the chance to review and assess dozens and dozens of YLI CVs before. And what you're gonna hear from me are genuine things that really, how should I say this the nice way? That really made me disinterested, you know, in proceeding with reviewing the complete CV or even proceeding to review the essay, right? So again, as I mentioned earlier, it only takes about 3 to 5 seconds for a recruiter or a selector to understand who you are and whether it makes a good impression or not, right? And the things that I'm going to show you right now are things that you can easily avoid, right? Easily avoid. So let's just get right into it. Number 1, in terms of spelling and grammar, a lot of participants still misspell some words or they use the wrong grammar. Now this can be avoided, right? Because there is only one way of correct spelling, right? And grammar is also, there are rules around it as well, right? Now we understand that sometimes you might be asked to submit a CV that is not in the language that you are most comfortable with, right? For example, if you've always been in Indonesia in this case, right? Your entire life, and then you also went to an Indonesian university, but then you were asked to apply for your CV in English, what you can do is try and take a crack at it, right? But there are several tips around it. So the first thing that you can do is basically turn on the autocorrect spelling feature on your Microsoft Word, right? That automatically points you out the errors and then you can correct it, right? Now, and by the way, and I know a lot of people do this, do not, I repeat, do not write your CV in Bahasa Indonesia and then Google Translate it. Okay, because that is very obvious, and a lot of times what you do is that you don't review it again and it comes across very weird, right? So take a crack at it in English and then have someone review it. Okay, now the second thing is bad layout. So one thing you want to do, right, when you do submit a CV is make the recruiter's experience easy when it comes to reading your CV, right? One thing that you can avoid is having bad layout. Now, what do I mean by bad layout? Bad layout is when you see a CV, it does not look like a CV, right? You would have very lengthy paragraphs. So for example, a lot of people like to share their aspirations. The one-liner, supposed to be one or two liners at the top of the CV, right under your name. Some people go off and prefer to write a poem about it, right? Or a paragraph. We strongly recommend you not to do so, right? And this also applies, by the way, in the body of the CV as well, when you write your experiences, right? So it's always better to have bullet points, make it easy to read visually, basically, is what we're saying, right? The next one would be inconsistent structure. Now, basically what we mean here is when you write a CV, right, it's very easy to spot the people who are good in communicating their experiences and not, just by judging whether or not they use consistent structure. And by structure, for example, right, if you put your experience, a very obvious example is when you want to first state which organization you were part of, right? What year you took part in that organization and where it took place. Right? Now, in the case where you actually have multiple experiences like that, right? We still see a lot of participants who just go back and forth in terms of the structuring, right? So you would put the organization name first, but then when it comes to the year and the role and the place, right? They all get jumbled up, and then every time they put the experience, it's just not consistent, and it's not a really great experience for your employer to do that, right? Now again, if you are applying for YLI, thankfully we help you with that. So you just have to fill in the details. But in the event when you're applying for a CV outside, when you do your job hunting, and it's not submitted electronically, you just need to ensure proper consistency when it comes to structuring, right? Now, then we have style, basically. What style means is basically, so we do understand that sometimes participants want to stand out, right? Participants want to show a little bit of their personal flavor, right? However, it's really important to also understand who your audience is, right? If you are applying for a slightly towards the conventional corporate setting, right? Or in this case, YLI, we prefer a style that is commonly known as being professional in general, right? And to give you a contrast, right? This is instead of maybe, for example, if you want to apply in the creative space, right? In an advertising industry, agency, for example, right? Where they do require to see your portfolio, they want you to express yourself visually and design-wise, for example, right? Now, if you're applying for a while, it's always better to just keep it formal, right? The next one would be personal details. Now, this can come across as pretty obvious for some participants, but we still see some of these mistakes, by the way, where we would forget. So one of the mistakes is that we would forget to update our latest phone number, right? So I'll give you an example. For example, if you are a participant who have done your studies overseas, right? And then you come back to Indonesia, you've done like a 6-year internship, right? And then now you want to apply for YLI, right? So maybe not six to a year of experience, but you recently graduated from an overseas study, right? And then you come back and then you still have your overseas number there. A lot of people still do that, right? So in the event where we really want to call this candidate, we're not able to do that because it's not updated, right? Hopefully this one should be pretty straightforward for you. Now the next one that I want to talk about is in terms of your work experience, right? Now, this is probably the most common thing that participants or candidates get wrong, right? And I want to spend a little bit of time on this because this is what will set you apart, right? Again, I've reviewed dozens and dozens of YLI CVs, and still I would actually say the majority of candidates still do not do this, right? And that is not only describing what your job description was, but also what you have achieved or did differently. But what's not easy to do is describing the so what, right? When it came time for you to complete your responsibility, what did you contribute, basically, right? In order to help you answer that question, right, you can think of two questions. Number one, how did it start with, right? In the beginning, when you had not entered, like what was the situation like? And then after, the second thing you need to ask yourself is when you left, what is it that you left behind? I'll give you an example. If you are in charge of organizing a festival, for example, in your university, right? You can say something like, I have managed to raise funds of the amount, let's say, and I'm making this up, right? 300 million rupiahs, for example, right? Which was much larger than the previous years, right? If it's a fundraising event, for example, right? But if it's a festival and you want more people to come, right? Maximum audience to come, then you can state the number of audiences that came as well, right? So we successfully attracted 2,000 people to come to that event. That's good. But how can you make it great? You make a comparison to the previous years, for example, if applicable. Stating your interests that are not really work in nature, right? Now, we understand that there are loads of CV samples out there that ask you to, try and be interesting, basically, right? Because basically, when again, right, a CV should be a reflection of who you are, right? So a lot of people try to stand out by trying to be interesting, right? By stating their hobbies, for example. Avoid mumbo jumbo and fluffy interest and focus more on the hard content, right? And that is what I mentioned earlier on stating your job description and what you have achieved significantly. The next one is CV's do's and don'ts. You have access to this page, so you can read this by yourself. But what I will do is I do want to stress on the most important things as well, right? So again, it really comes down to the format first, because that's what we usually see first, right? But most importantly, the content as well, right? So the key messages and how you communicate it, right? It really, really comes down to those two, right? A couple of things I want to touch on before we close this is if you can list quantitative data, right? Again, that will set you apart, specifically when it comes to expressing your impact, by the way, right? But before the impact, you can also use quantitative data when it comes to communicating a certain standard out there, like for example, your GPA, your GMAT scores, fluency in languages, and all of that. when we ask for your CV, right, when you do apply for us for the program, what we want to see is your leadership ability, right? Again, remember why we would want you, right? We would want you when you have very, very strong potential in your leadership skills. And the way we see that is by looking into the kinds of activities that you were part of within the past 3 to 5 years, right? So you need to prioritize what you put in your CV based on that, right? So, and this can also be translated in your job description as well, right? So your role and your job description really, really matters. And one thing I want to highlight is this, right? What if, for example, I've never led a team before, right? Because we do get applicants like that, by the way, right? The majority, yes, they are probably, head of some student club, right? Or president of some committee. But if you've not had the chance to do that before, don't be discouraged, right? Because you can still have really good potential by what? Let me tell you. Let's say you are an officer, right? You're an events officer, you're part of the events team, there's already an event leader, and then you're an events officer. By role, you may not be the leader, but when you go to the description, you can still imply leadership abilities, right? So things like, for example, the fact that you initiated something, right? The fact that you were the one who, for example, solved a particular challenge, right? Or your ability to problem solve, right? So try and flesh out more of that in the body of your experience. That it should be a snapshot of who you are. It should be a snapshot of who your authentic self is, by the way, right? So be confident enough in your experience. There's no need to exaggerate any facts. So that, in a nutshell, was our very quick tips and tricks on CV writing. Again, we really, really hope that was useful for you, and please don't shy away from applying, okay? It's all a matter of communicating and articulating very clearly what your experiences are, and don't forget to also express the impact as well. Quantify the impact. I can never be bored in repeating that. So yeah, looking forward for your applications. Good luck.